directors at Derby, as Andy stated before we start. What I've been asked to talk to you about is rail accident and the resultant legislation. The legislation side, I'm going to broaden a little bit and actually kind of make this more about rail accidents and how it's kind of changed our industry. Some of that through legislation, some of that through other means. We're not going to get too deep into the legislative side of it, because I think you'd probably all be leaving the call quite quickly if we got into too much depth onto that. So what we're actually going to talk about is a little bit of history, a little bit of how we've got to where we are today. Then I'll talk a little bit about the Cullen report and the creation of RAIB, which will lead us into a very short section talking about what the RAIB do and our remit. And then I'll end the session with a little bit of a look about some of the more notable recent accidents and how they are changing or have changed the industry as we are today. And then just a very quick sum up after that. I always start these presentations because this is kind of based on something we talk about on the level 3 engineering diploma with PWI. Always start with a couple of slides. Well, why do we do it in the first instance? Why do we investigate? Well, here's a quote from 1905. So, but I'm sure you've all seen very similar things. Basically, if you don't learn from your mistakes, you're going to make them all over again. And something that kind of cuts through a lot of our work is that we see things happen again and again, and we just kind of want to make sure the industry is learning and the industry is remembering. And I think that's a common thread through a lot of what we'll talk about today, and particularly because a lot of the things we take for granted have come through events that have happened many, many years ago, and understanding why we do things the way we do things might actually require a little bit of remembering of accidents gone by. The other slide I like to show is this one. You will have seen this on health and safety boards all over the country. This kind of pyramid model of accidents. The key thing here I want to point out is, well, two things really. The first is this is scalable. So if we reduce the number of near misses we have, in theory, the number of fatalities we have is going to reduce proportionately. But the other thing is that we can learn as much from the bottom level of this pyramid as we can from any of the others. So if we learn from our near misses and our precursor events, we don't have to wait for the fatalities before we start learning the lessons. Unfortunately, what you will see from a lot of the things we talk about, is that, sorry, Andy, can you, there's just a couple of things saying you can't see the slides. Is anyone else having an issue before I continue?
No, I can see them.
Okay.
See them all right.
Sorry, Andy, I think it appears to be your end then, and everyone else seems to be fine, I'm afraid. So just to summarise, the one thing I want to point out here is we seem to wait for tragedy to occur before we have major change. We don't have to do that. We can learn from non-tragic events. However, the big difference is, of course, that after tragedy, people's wallets open, people's thoughts are on how we can stop this tragedy happening again. And I think back to something I remember Steve Featherstone talking about when he was with infrastructure projects after not a safety tragedy but commercial tragedy. And Steve said after a big incident that the advice he was given was not to waste it. And it's a bit of a strange way to put it, but if something really does go wrong, I think as an industry we need to make sure that we get the learning out of that and we use the momentum that we have following that incident to make the changes necessary. I want to take you back to the middle of the 19th century. So we're going way, way, way back, right to the initial stages of the railway. So 1861 and at Clayton Tunnel. Clayton Tunnel's south of London on the line to Brighton. And when I describe this, it sounds bonkers now, but you have to bear in mind the time we're in. And the way that the control worked here is that there was effectively a a blockman, as they would call it then, who would be at the end of the tunnel. And when one train went in, they would start timing. And then after a certain amount of time had passed, would allow a second train into the tunnel. And you can already see why this could be a problem. And sure enough, on 25th of August, 1861, a train ended up being stuck inside the tunnel, and another one was let in and basically struck it. This led us to what we now call the block concept. You will have heard this in various guises around signalling, but essentially one train in one section at one time. That fundamental principle, which we still operate on to this day in the vast majority of lines on this in the country. So this led to 23 fatalities, I think going off 200 injuries as well. So this block concept, just keep that in mind for a minute. 9 years later, north of the border in Kirtlebridge, so this is kind of on the line between Carlisle and Lockerbie, so just north of the border up there. We had another collision, and this led to the interlocking of points with signals, something that wasn't in place at the time. And the station master and the person involved in the shunting operation didn't communicate properly, and the signaller allowed an express train in when the shunter had put a train over in front of it. So 11 people died. The shunter was able to swing the points, and the signaller was able to clear the signal, even though the points weren't set for that signal manoeuvre. And that interlocking of signalling with points and with detection is now a fundamental part of all the signalling systems we have. So what, 100 and going on for 150 years later, no, just over 150 years later. And the final one in this kind of intro, I just want to put into your minds is what was one of the worst accidents we've ever had in the British Isles. This was over in Northern Ireland in Armagh. There's a very steep incline at Armagh, and the train was struggling to get up it. So in order to assist it, they split the train. And after splitting the train, the section that was kind of separated from the locomotive, the brakes weren't capable of holding it, and it basically went down the incline, and collision occurred, leading to 80 fatalities, 260 injuries, and a third of those were kids. And you can understand why that was a turning point in the industry, and one where people just said this cannot happen again. Now, in the same year as that, the regulation of the Railways Act came in. So this is the first kind of major piece of legislation I wanted to highlight. Those three concepts we just spoke about, the block system of signalling, one train, one section, one time, the interlocking of points and signals, and actually having decent brakes on your trains, and that fail safe if your train splits. Those three concepts are still in place today. And in fact, the 1889 Regulation Act is still in place today, albeit it's been heavily superseded by various other bits of legislation, but these fundamental concepts still apply. The other thing that's interesting about this is, even though we're talking about something that is well over 100 years ago, there are actually some early focuses now on safety critical working hours. Nothing like we have now, but already people were thinking about how fatigue affects people working on the railway, particularly those around safety critical staff. Let's go forward a little bit. 1915. 1915 is the year that the worst railway accident we've ever had in the UK happened at Quintin's Hill. Double collision, you can see the death figure there, 226, absolutely tragic accident, and still remains the worst one we've had. There were two signallers involved. Effectively, one of them overlooked a train that was stood right outside the signal box. Made worse by the fact we had wooden coaches with gas lamps, so you can see why that was always going to lead to a fairly big fire. There's been a lot of kind of additional work done on this in recent years, in the last sort of 20, 30 years. looking at the actions of what resulted from this, because it was really pinned on the signallers, I think it's fair to say. And I think looking back at it with a fresh pair of eyes and with the benefit of many decades of accident investigation experience, I think there was far more to learn from this, I think it's fair to say. But what was clear is that there were various rules breaches, but there was a heavy reliance on the signaller vigilance, on basic signallers doing the right thing. Yeah, thank you, Rob. Yeah, they also didn't use various things available to them, which would have helped, quite right. But I think looking back at it, there was an interesting documentary, I think it was on the BBC, about this. There's various publications about it. It's worth looking into if you get a chance. We don't have time today, unfortunately. Let's go forward to the 50s. Harrow and Wealdstone was another very, very tragic collision, which resulted in 112 people losing their lives. About half of those were railway staff, which for us in our industry is a little bit galling, I think it's fair to say. Remember what I said at Quintin Hill, there was this kind of idea that signallers were going to remain vigilant, that signallers would never make a mistake. Well, what Harrow and Wealdstone kind of taught us is, leading on from that, there was still a kind of assumption that drivers were always going to do the right thing, that drivers were always going to obey the signals, they were never going to make an error. And Harrow and Wealdstone led to the introduction of AWS, which we still have today. The lock, block, brake concept we spoke about earlier. Now, two of those protect against signallers making errors, the lock and the block. The brake is obviously your last ditch defence if everything goes wrong, but there's still this given that drivers are going to do the right thing. So AWS got kind of introduced following this. It took a little bit of a while for it to be rolled out, but still we use this system today. It's not perfect. I think we often talk about things like habituation today, about how drivers will hit the AWS mushroom really without thinking about it. But here we have a system which is finally in the cab and assisting drivers to try and make the correct decision if they come against a signal on a restrictive aspect. Just a couple more, and then we'll talk about kind of more recent times. But 1988, we saw the Clapham fatalities. I think it was 4 trains involved. Now I think about, I was about to say 3. It was 4 trains, wasn't it, to Clapham? 35 fatals. Ultimately came down to an issue with old wiring in a relay room, I think it was. That was still in place, and when new wiring was installed, the redundant wiring hadn't been secured properly, and they end up with a false feed, leading to a signal not displaying red. There were lots of things came out of this. I mean, the Hidden inquiry done by Anthony Hidden made 93 recommendations. Now, some of those are fairly small, some of them are massive. A lot of those recommendations now underpin the principles of which the SMTH, the Signal Maintenance Testers Handbook, is based. A lot of the things around independent checking, about following defined checking and installation and maintenance processes is all in there. Some really interesting things around the control of fatigue. You'll all have heard of hidden hours and the way we work with that. A lot of that came out of obviously the Hidden inquiry. There were people here working 7-day weeks for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. So not even having a single day off. And that seems, again, quite alien to us now. Also things around things like cab signal box radios. The driver of one of these trains was at a line-side phone, so actually wasn't really involved in the collision while his train got struck. But if it was able to get in touch with the signaller quicker, would it have been different? Questions like that. So Clapham, still feeling the after effects of this today. And if you read RIB's reports into the incidents at Waterloo and Wingfield and Cardiff, you will see that we've spoken about some of the learning from Clapham maybe being a bit diluted over time. Are the signal engineers of today particularly aware of what happened at Clapham, and are the lessons that were learned after Clapham in the memory of the industry? I think they are with certainly a lot of people on the call today. I recognise a few of the names there, but as people come in, do we really talk to them about what happened? Because the learning from this is critical to the way we do things. So that's a little bit of the history. I want to talk to you about kind of more recent times, let's say the last 25 years, and in particular the period around the late 90s and into the 2000s. This was what I've maybe a little bit underplayed by calling a difficult time for the railway. You can see from this graph, this is kind of moving train accidents involving people on the trains. You can see that there's this big cluster around the late 90s and early 2000s, and you will recognise many of the names on the left-hand side there. You will also see 3 bars on the right, and we'll talk a little bit about a couple of those in a bit. Those 3 being Greyrig, Sandilands, and Carmont, and Terlervig in 2024. 1999, you'll see the biggest spike of 31, which is the accident at Ladbroke Grove. Also coincides with the same year that the rail safety regulations came in. Now, there's some really, there's some things around the use of Mark 1 rolling stock and slam doors and central locking, which I'm sure many of you remember leaning out of HST carriages to open the doors and that not being restricted at all. Again, seems quite alien to people coming into the industry now. But I think the big one that we look at is the introduction of train protection, various things around a system that will put on the brakes of a train if the driver doesn't comply with stop signal, or indeed travels too fast, or is approaching buffer stops too fast, etc. And this ultimately led to the introduction of TPWS. Now, TPWS is something that we're talking about a lot in the industry at the moment about, this is now 25 years on. TPWS was, I think it's fair to say, rolled out at a pace. It has been incredibly effective. I think far more effective and far easier to implement than people really thought it was going to be. And it's probably given us a good 20 to 25 years of a much safer railway. Is it the answer going forward? Is a big question that's in the industry at the moment, and one that I know will be going around in boardrooms at GBR, I'm sure, when that starts off. So TPWS still something we're taking great interest in. As I said, 1999 was Ladbroke Grove. There's a picture from the scene. You can see just how serious an accident it was. 31 people lost their lives, over 500 injured, which is frankly huge number. This was caused by a spad at a signal that people knew was a bit iffy, I think it's fair to say, and had been spadded before. Say this head-on collision occurred between a commuter train and an intercity train. You can see the burnt out coach to the left-hand side of the picture there. That was basically just a big inferno, and a lot of people weren't able to survive that. Following Ladbroke Grove, Lord Cullen was tasked with undertaking the inquiry. Now, Lord Cullen's report was effectively split into 2. It's actually 2 separate inquiries, but the first one of those was looking at the accident itself, understanding why it happened, what we can do to stop it happening again. The second one was actually more fundamental, was actually looking at the way safety is managed around the industry. And I'll show you a model here. Now, this is a bit simplified. It was far more complex than this. For instance, there were big changes to the BTP and their remit. But for the kind of purpose of today and keeping it brief, I've simplified this into kind of what HMRI used to do. So HMRI at the time was Her Majesty's Railway Inspectorate, and is now His Majesty's Railway Inspectorate. They were involved across the industry. So here you have an organisation which is involved in approvals and standard setting, is also involved in investigation, and you can kind of see why this could lead to a conflict. effectively, where the organisation could end up investigating itself. The term one of my colleagues uses, marking your own homework. And when Lord Cullen looked at this, he looked to other transport modes, and the aviation and the marine industry, who also have accident investigation branches like ourselves, and their model is quite different. And the model used, particularly in the aviation industry, was seen as good practice, and this was ported over into the railways. So the HMRI was effectively split up, and for simplification, I've split it into three kind of wings. The first one of these is what is currently the ORR. So this is now our Office of Rail Regulation, as it was then, now the Office of Rail and Road. This replaced what was the rail regulator. So this is where HMRI still exists. So HMRI still exists within the ORR. They're our safety regulator. They are looking at health and safety at work. Think about it as a bit like being HSE, but for the railways. But they also have economic function. They also have highway function, hence the Office of Rail and Road. So the ORR pretty much doing what the HMRI's classic duties were around approvals, making sure that the day-to-day railway is safe. The standard setting has kind of gone over to RSSB, the Rail Safety and Standards Board. They do a lot of the research and development. They do a lot of the data analysis, looking at the industry as a whole, understanding the interfaces between rolling stock and infrastructure and all those kind of things. And then accident investigation came out to be a separate stream, which is where RAIB was founded. All of this was done through this 2003 Railways and Transport Safety Act. You will hear me, I'll just refer to it as the Act or the 2003 Act. And in addition to that, we have the 2005 regulation. So while the 2003 primary legislation, the primary act of Parliament, was kind of created the RAIB, the 2005 regulations, which is like a secondary piece of legislation, actually kind of gave us the working tools to do that. So the 2003 Act kind of gives us the very high level stuff, and the 2005 regulations gives us more meat on the bone sort of thing. So it covers things like the requirement of duty holders to actually tell us when something's gone wrong, tells us how we are meant to operate and do our investigations, how we look at evidence, how it's disclosed, how it's preserved, how it's used. Also tells us what our report should do, what our report should look like, how we consult with the industry, how we make recommendations, and puts a requirement on the Chief Inspector to produce an annual report to show the workings of the branch and what's happened over the last year. So all those things are actually written in law and things we have to abide by. That leads us to the way the RAIB operate, and at its highest level, the RAIB's purpose is quite simple. The RAIB is quite simple in the fact we are here to improve railway safety. We do that by making recommendations, and we are here to inform the public. That also includes the industry. So everything we do is not behind closed doors. It is available for all to see. And actually, that means that in many cases, we can act in lieu of public inquiry, which means our reports are seen as the truth, effectively. To allow us to do that, we are fiercely independent. We do not apportion blame. We do not apportion liability. We are purely here to say what went wrong, why it went wrong, and what can we do to stop it happening again. We're not going to say whose fault it is, who's going to pay for it, who should be prosecuted for it, etc. Just to answer a question on the side, David, I didn't mention LRSSB because I was just talking about the 2003 Act at the time. LRSSB has kind of happened later on, so hence why I didn't mention it there. RAIB scope, well, we cover basically almost everything rail related in the country, so everything on the main line, the underground system, so London Underground, Glasgow Subway, metros, all the second generation tramways, including the heritage operation at Blackpool. We cover the Channel Tunnel up to the halfway point when it becomes the jurisdiction of our French counterparts, although we obviously work very closely with Bayat, who are the French equivalent. And we cover around about 100 heritage lines, including a couple of heritage tramways, a couple are various narrow gauge, various standard gauge, and everything in between. So a very broad scope. Also got some slightly more esoteric things in scope. So the Cairngorm Mountain Railway is in scope, the Great Orme Tramway is in scope, etc., etc. In order for us to do that, the 2003 Act actually gives us some powers, so legal powers. Section 8 of the 2003 Act allows an REIB inspector to enter pretty much anywhere in the conduct of an investigation. So for some reason, it splits it down into three of railway property, land adjacent to the railway, and anywhere else. Now, the third one kind of trumps the other two, really. It obviously has to be in line with our investigation, but we don't need to get a search warrant to do that because we're not there to confer liability or blame. And we can seize evidence, make records, take photos, etc. We can seize documents. What's interesting to a lot of people, an REIB interview, you're not being interviewed under caution, so you don't get the right of silence. So we can compel you to answer. However, we're fiercely protective of our witnesses, so we cannot disclose witness details. We can't disclose the statement of what you said. We can't disclose any medical things you tell us. If someone wanted to get that information, they'd have to take us to the High Court, and it's not yet been managed in 100 and something years of accident investigation. So we're fiercely protective of those powers. They allow us to do our job and do it at the best of our ability. The Act and the regulations also tell us what we have to investigate. So by law, we have to investigate any serious rail accident. Now, what's a serious rail accident? That is a derailment or a collision, so it's got to involve effectively a moving train that results in the death of a person, serious injury to 5 or more people, or extensive damage. Extensive damage is currently quoted as being 2 million euros or more. It's not yet caught up with Brexit. I'm just expecting that'll be about £2 million or more. But we also have the prerogative to investigate other accidents that don't meet those criteria, and we normally make that decision based on how serious it is and whether we think there's a lot to be learned. And I would say the vast majority of what we do actually is that using those discretionary powers, because we don't get all that many derailments or collisions that result in one of those bad outcomes. The majority of them are those near misses and those precursor events. So we use our powers to investigate those because we can learn as much from them as we can, waiting for something more serious to happen. In order to do that, we've got 2 bases. We've got one in Derby, one in Farnborough. A relatively modest team, around about 25 operational staff and about 20 support staff. And we've got a minimum of 5 on call at any one point. And we will go anywhere. It might be Northern Ireland, it might be the very north of Scotland, it might be the depths of Cornwall or Kent. It doesn't matter. We can go to anywhere in the country, and we will go by whatever means necessary. The response time is generally we want to be on the road within 30 minutes. So regardless of when it is, we keep our inspectors on a fairly close leash, shall we say, ready to go. Our inspectors are a bit of a mixed bunch. Most of us come from the rail industry, but not exclusively. We've got a couple of ex-policemen, one ex-BTP and one ex-Home Office. We have someone who used to work for the ORR. We poach them, which is good. We've got an ex-MOD person, an ex-HSE person. But regardless of where you come from, we train you up to be a generalist. So while we have a vast smorgasbord of experience, so my experience is firmly within the track world, albeit with some civil engineering thrown in, but all of our staff are trained to have a fundamental understanding of signalling and rolling stock, heritage, human factors, etc., etc. We're also given a lot of training on forensic recovery. My wife likes to joke that it's a bit like CSI Railways. I think that makes it sound far more glamorous than it is. The reality is we can do forensic recovery. We can recover things to courtroom standards. We are trained to interview people. What I consider the hardest part of the job, we will go and sit with families of people who've been involved in accidents and give them as much information as they wish, really, around how their loved one came to pass, potentially. Really difficult part of the job, by far and away the most emotionally demanding, certainly. The key thing is you've got to know the right questions to ask, and that's the fundamental kind of thing I always fall back on, is know who you need to ask and know what you're going to ask. The 2005 regs put a duty on duty holders, a requirement on duty holders to notify us. And to do that, we have a number of schedules. Schedule 4 and 5 is specifically for the Channel Tunnel, so I won't dwell on those today, but they mirror pretty much Schedule 1 and 2. Schedule 1 is your serious stuff. So that is fatalities, serious injuries to multiple people, derailments, collisions, near misses, anything which is a serious rail accident effectively, or a potential one. For those accidents, people are expected to pick up the phone and give us a call straight away. Near miss is an interesting one, what we call 1-9s. 1-9s are things which we got away with under slightly different circumstances, could have been really serious. Schedule 2s are less serious things. These are normally notified within a few working days. Obstructions on the track, road vehicle incursions, fires, things like that. Monthly returns are Schedule 3s. These are generally things which we just keep an eye on. They're not immediately notifiable to us, but we just want to kind of keep a handle on to see what is happening across the industry. The vast majority of what we get in is really in the Schedule 2 category, being honest. We get quite a few of those. Schedule 1s, thankfully, don't get all that many. They are the ones where we're generally deploying people. There is a handy guide to these on our website. I don't expect you to be able to read that now, but that is available. It's called the N3. If you go on our website, you can find that. The product of all of this is our reports. They make recommendations to the industry. The responsibility of following those up lies with the ORR and not ourselves, generally, if it's in the rail industry anyway. If it's to a third party, we'll follow up directly. But we have a good dialogue with the ORR. If we don't think a recommendation has been closed properly, we do have ways of flagging that up. I was going to talk a little bit about the trends and what we see before I talk about a couple of recent accidents. This is from our annual report over the last few years. So the annual report kind of summarises what we've seen over the last year. So I've kind of pulled these together over the last 5 years. You can see the biggest bar on the left. Events involving moving trains and staff is basically track work and near misses or strikes. So track work and jobs still very high. We'll talk a little bit about one of those in a minute. SPADs, events involving moving people and trains, is generally platform interfaces. So people falling down the gap between a train and the platform or something like that. Level crossings, freight derailments used to be very high. Thankfully, over the last 15 years, there's been a big shift in freight derailments. They're no longer anywhere near as common as they were 15, 20 years ago. One accident we will talk about in all of our presentations for the immediate future, certainly, is the accident at Carmont. This happened in the height of lockdown. So Aberdeen, just north of Carmont, was in full lockdown at the time. There's a really good animation which shows you the details of this available on our website. In the interest of time, and because it doesn't play all that well over Teams, I've not included it today. But if you get a chance, go and have a look. Because this is definitely a turning point in our industry, Carmont, I think. And I think the video really helps summarise the accident far better than I can in the short time we have today. Carmont resulted in 3 people losing their life, and the other 6 people on the train were injured. Only 9 people in total on that train. If this had happened outside of COVID, we probably would have been looking at 50 people on that train, 50 to 60, something like that. So you can see that would have been a far more serious accident. It was already serious enough. The train struck some debris that had been washed out from around a drain. You can see it on that top photo there. The bottom photo, you can see this kind of funnel feature. That's some LiDAR data. But halfway up that funnel feature, there's like an earth bund, which was never intended to be there. And that meant that some of the water flow was concentrated, sort of at the bottom of where it says Gully 1 there. That concentration led to that drainage material being washed out, and that led to it being on the track. The train was coming at almost line speed because there was no reason for that train to have a speed restriction on it at the time. And then it derailed before basically an underbridge and a viaduct just after the derailment occurred meant that the train met a void effectively. You can see the aftermath in that photo on the right. There were 20 recommendations made, some of them quite changing in the industry. I won't go through all of them. Please have a look at that report. I would consider it almost compulsory reading. There is 2 versions of it. There's a full report, but there's also a synopsis, which is a bit more digestible. And please go and have a look at that, even if you look at the summary and the conclusions, if nothing else. I said I'd talk a little bit about track worker incidents. Here's a list of ones that have been serious enough for the RAIB to be involved. So bear in mind, there's a lot more than this. These are ones where the RAIB have written something about it since the beginning of, this is things that have been published since the beginning of January 2017, so sort of last 7 or 8 years or so. The ones that are in bold and green were fatalities. The most serious of, oh, sorry, one more slide before I get to that. You can see that this is the trend from track worker fatalities over the last sort of 30 years. Again, that period around the late 90s, early 2000s wasn't great at all. But then over time, through the 2000s and into the 2010s, the numbers began to fall away a little bit. And then in 2014, we had the lookout struck at Newark Northgate. And following that, there was a period of about 4.5 years. It looks a bit less on the graph just because of when they happened within the year. But that period between 2014 and 18, I'd say about 4.5 years without a track worker fatality. And I think as an industry, and I count myself amongst this, we thought we'd nailed it. And then you see that cluster 2018 to 21, which shows us that actually this was already waiting to happen again. And the one in 2019 was a double fatality at Margam. We often hear from people, and I think it's fair to say there's an assumption that this happens to people who aren't very experienced. Well, the team at Margam were very experienced. There was over 100 years experience between that team of 6 people. And one of these guys who passed away was a PWI member. We can all get things wrong on occasion. Margam, if you work on track, please go and give that report a read. Again, even if you just look at the summary and conclusions. To understand some of the things that happened at Margam, I think is quite fundamental to the way some of us work. And following Margam, it's fair to say there's been a big shift in the way that track access and working on track happens. So this hasn't required legislative change. This has been a process change within Network Rail. And the idea of going out there with lookouts now is just not really a thing. There's still little pockets of it out there, but very, very, very much in the minority. And I think by the end of next year, this will not be a thing that we see at all. This modal shift, I think we're still feeling the after effects of it. I'm not going to comment really to what we think is happening, but because we're still collecting the data, I think it's fair to say. But what is clear is that near miss rates have gone down, so that's a win certainly. But we still see some. We've got an active investigation at the moment with a near miss at Chiltern Green, which is kind of Luton way. And what we're beginning to see is this is exposing issues with site wards and separated working. And a kind of more overarching question is this compromising access to track? Is this compromising inspections? Is this compromising access to do maintenance? And that's a question we don't know yet, but I think we're definitely keeping an eye on it, shall we say. And just to close, I'll just talk very briefly about a couple of investigations we have ongoing. I'm not going to really, I don't really want to take too many questions on these because they're active investigations, so things are still happening on these. But I think it'd be remiss of me not to mention them at least. So on the left there, you can see an aerial photo from a collision at Talerdig, which is in mid Wales. This happened last month, led to the death of one person and multiple injuries to others, multiple other people being injured, should I say. We're in a low adhesion situation here. One train was trying to stop at Talerdig Loop, which is on the brow of a hill. It was unable to stop and ended up descending the hill into a single line section with the other train coming in the opposite direction. Led to this head-on collision, which you can see in the middle. What I can say, because we've announced it, is there was some issues with the sanding equipment on that train, as well as there being generally low adhesion conditions in the area. So we will almost certainly release something, an interim type report, once we have a bit more detail on that. The other investigation of particular note recently, particularly from a PWI perspective, is the derailment at Audenshaw. This didn't get as much press because it happened away from kind of the travelling public, but this was one which is quite serious in our industry, led to a lot of disruption in the area. What we saw was gauge spread as that freight train crossed over an underbridge. Early evidence is suggesting we might have some issues with coach screws on the longitudinal timber and the base plates there. So I say no injuries, but significant damage and disruption. We published an urgent safety advice for maintenance operators to look at coach screws. So if you are involved in PWI maintenance, please go and have a look at that. It's available on our website. So just to summarise before we take any questions, this is kind of my personal feeling rather than necessarily an REIB thing, but I think it's fair to say that it's quite sad that sometimes it takes something really bad to happen before we make a change. Not small changes, but definitely large-scale changes generally follow in the wake of something really bad happening. But we can learn those lessons without waiting for that tragedy to occur. But to do that, we've got to take near misses seriously. We've got to report them. And when they are reported, we've got to do our best to learn the lessons and to make any recommendations from those actually effective. To do that, doing a good job of investigation is critical. Now, I'd like to think that REIB are fairly good at this, since it is actually what our day job is. But what we're seeing in the industry is actually over time, the industry's investigations are getting better and better and better. And kudos to the various investigation teams, particularly Network Rail, who've done a really good job in getting those investigations to where they are. If you get a chance, REIB run various investigation seminars, normally once a year or twice a year. If you get a chance to go on one of those, fantastic. There's also various courses available. Cranfield University particularly do a lot in this. Investigations on a kind of high level kind of setting, a good investigation shows that actually we're taking safety seriously, that action is going to be taken, lessons will be learnt. You will hear that in the wake of tragedy. A lot of people say lessons will be learnt. What does that actually mean? Well, you've got to actually put those lessons into action. And doing a good investigation and getting good recommendations from that is the vehicle for doing that. And a slightly cautionary note, we're about to enter another time of quite big change in our industry. You know, we've got Great British Railways coming in, the model of our industry is going to move around a little bit. And I think it's the duty on all of us to make sure that that transition is as safe and as seamless as it can possibly be. So thank you, everyone. I hope that's been fairly interesting. If there's any questions, please, I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks, Andy.
John, thank you very much indeed for that. Very, very interesting for me, particularly to see the look back through things I was involved in and how it's gone on since then. There's two comments I'm going to make before I throw it open. The first one, the first accident you referred to is Claydon. One of the interesting things about that is that although they got away from time interval working on regular working, it continued for degraded working even into my career. There was an accident near Worcester sometime around 1970, either just before or just after I started on the railway, when they were using time interval working, and the same thing happened. The train in front failed in the section, and the following train ran up the back, at which point the rule book was changed. So yes, we learn the lessons, but sometimes we don't learn all of the lessons as quickly as we could have done. Quinton's Hill, I totally agree with you that blaming the signallers alone was utterly wrong. Track circuit technology was well known by then, and the Caledonian Railways had not put track circuits in on the West Coast Main Line for economic reasons, and that was very conveniently ignored in all the investigations. I think it's a measure of how far on we've come in investigations since 1915, that if we did that now, it would certainly be looking at that. I'm going to throw it open, but David Holt, I'm not going to pick up on the Sandilands definition. The train left the rails, legally that's a derailment. I don't want to take the time up on that. Tina, could I ask you to take up the question on recommendations legally binding, please?
Could you just say that again for me to rephrase my question, you mean?
Yes, please.
Yeah, just because just for a bit of background, I am quite relatively new to the rail industry, and I work as a HSQE coordinator. I was just wondering, when recommendations are made by RAIB, is it automatically legally binding across the whole industry, or do you just take a recommendation as it fits? It might be an obvious answer, but I just ask this.
No, there is some nuance to it, Tina. So thank you for the question. The recommendation is, first of all, it's just that, it's a recommendation. It's not a diktat. So it's not that you have to do it. It is that we recommend you look at this. And if you look at RAIB recommendations, they're normally targeted towards a particular stakeholder. The OR, you have a legal obligation to consider it, is the way to put I would put it. So what I generally say to people I meet with is, you need to have a look at it. And if you are going to put it in place, tell us how you're doing it. If you decide that you can't do it for whatever reason, you need to tell us why. And then the ORR has to be satisfied that justification is correct. So it can be, you could, for instance, say the only way of fixing this is to spend far too much money. And if you can then show that that is not reasonably practicable, is the term used, then the ORR may be content with that. But you have to go and at least have a look at it and decide to the ORR satisfaction that you've done that properly. Does that make sense?
No, it does. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you, Tina. Steve Williams, your question about Carmont?
Thanks, Andy. At Carmont, one of the primary reasons why things didn't go to plan there was because it wasn't built in accordance with the design. So my question is, what are your thoughts on the need for appropriate supervision of works or independent oversight and monitoring of the works to help assure construction meets with the AFC design?
I'm going to be a little bit guarded on the answer somewhat, Steve, because Carmont is still not been subject to its fatal accident inquiry. So we still have legal proceedings around Carmont. The FAI is the equivalent of coroner's court in England, for instance. So we still not had that full inquiry into how those 3 people lost their lives. So we'll be slightly guarded on the response for that reason. What I will say is that what Carmont highlighted is the interface between designer and contractor is critical. And understanding when decisions are made on site, for instance, how that's reported back to the design team and how it's understood is probably the thing in Carmont that I would look at if I'm looking at anything. The amount of supervision, well, that is a very much a movable feast, isn't it? Because it depends on the complexity and the severity of the work, I would say.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think I would add that one issue with Carmont is that, of course, the contractor was not there by the time it got to the investigation. Carillion had ceased to exist, and I'm not sure whether that affected the investigation or not. I'm not
what
I
will say is, we obviously, even though Carillion as an entity, which Andy and I are both familiar with, as we once worked for them, ceased to exist, we we did try and kind of follow up as best we could with various parties involved, and whether that be individuals or organisations. So we did as much, we did our part to try and unpick that, shall we say.
Yep. Okay, I don't see any hands up. Does anybody else have any other questions they want to raise?
Malcolm's got his hand up.
Yeah, Malcolm.
Yeah, I was thinking very carefully whether to ask this or not, but building on the point about RAIB recommending, operators responding, and ORR deciding whether it's good enough, I've sensed once or twice in the RAIB's annual report that the RAIB doesn't necessarily agree with decisions that ORR has made. And is there a route to escalate?
Yeah, so there is we have an interface with ORR where we have those conversations, shall we say. The difficulty is those conversations, they don't have quite as much legal kind of backing as some of the others. But we're grown-ups, we understand how this works. The one thing we're very careful of now, if you look at all our recommendations, as well as the recommendation itself, there's an intent above it. And we're quite careful with the ORR that intent is clear. Normally, when it's not been done to our satisfaction, is because the intent of the recommendation hasn't been understood. That's normally the thing we trip up on. So we had a piece of work about 6-7 years ago, which we still follow to this day, which is making better and recommendations to ensure that our intent is clear and that the stakeholder and the ORR know what that intent is.
Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks, Malcolm. Clive Cross. Clive, your hand is up. Can't see you, can't hear you. Look, Clive, I don't know if you're there, but if you are, you're very welcome to come in. Dominic Greenup asks, will the recording and slides be made available? And yes, they will. And any subsequent discussion as well, either through the PWI website or through its LinkedIn account. So please do go and look at those later if you want to take the discussion any further on. We've got about 5 minutes left. Clive seems to...
I was going to say, while we wait, what I will say is you can see on the slide now, there's our website. If you want any of our reports from the last almost 20 years now, they are all available there, and you can search and you can filter them by whether it's heritage or mainline, etc. Also, if you think of something else, my email address is there. Feel free to give me an email. I might not answer straight away because of workload or whatever, but I'll try and make sure you get a response as quick as I can.
Thank you. Clive, you've tried to type something and I've only got a few letters, which I presume is going to be should, but we still have time if you want to come in either verbally or... Rango, did you want to come in then?
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, just a simple question. I understand we are putting a lot of effort to make sure any small accidents or incidents will give some good lessons to avoid any future big accidents. Do you have any plan to check other part of the world? Anything?
So there's two parts. So the way that our organisation works is that we respond to accidents that are in our scope. So if there is an accident within the UK, effectively, then it's our job to go and have a look at it. If something happens overseas, we don't look at it actively, although we do sometimes have requests for help by our partners in other countries. So we're part of a collective of accident investigation branches which happen all over the place. And we have a really good dialogue and interface with them, and there's a lot of knowledge sharing, etc. And on times for instance, we've been helping Hong Kong to train some of their people. We're looking at Dubai. We had assistance to, remember the the crash with the container train in Denmark. So, for instance, we do get involved and we're asked for help, and we help where we can. But also, when we look at our own accidents that we have in the UK, if something has happened similarly overseas, we drag that learning in as part of our wider investigation.
What I would add, I don't know whether it still goes on, but certainly in my time, we had quite a lot of liaison with overseas accident investigation branches. I had a holiday in Japan and Korea, and ended up spending time with both the Japanese accident investigators and the Korean accident investigators, and certainly have met with American accident investigators coming over to learn from us. And I would imagine, John, you can comment, but I would imagine those international contacts still continue.
Yeah, and at a senior level and at working level as well.
Dominic's just come in and made the very valid point that vast numbers of early accident reports that were done by the Railway Inspectorate and the Board of Trade before them are on the Railways archive, and they're interesting reading, and on occasions necessary for RAIB to go and look at some of these older accidents as well.
I'll be honest, I was looking at a couple of them when I was putting this together, so.
I think that says it all. We've reached 1:30. So thank you to everybody for the questions, but particularly John, thank you so much for the presentation. I hope I haven't trodden too much on your toes. Could I ask everybody to give their thanks in the usual way? And then the next meeting, as I say, is on the 3rd of December, reforming the railway and the transition to Great British Railways. Thank you all very much, and good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.